Thanksgiving had always been a delicate dance in the Quinn household. Faux laughter, carefully plated dishes, and the subtle undercurrent of who had done more earned less, or simply annoyed the parents. I arrived that year carrying my usual quiet confidence, my suitcase packed more with old habits than family expectations. But something was different, something invisible, until that moment, hovered in the air like smoke from the fireplace. I never intended anyone to see the documents I kept tucked away in my bag. They were private, numbers and accounts that represented years of work, sleepless nights coding and pitching ideas, the countless tiny decisions that had quietly built a fortune I had never spoken of. But as I stepped into the kitchen, Nora's eyes caught the edge of a folder peeking from my bag. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharp but laced with curiosity that immediately turned to something darker. She flipped through the papers, and her expression changed from mild intrigue to stunned calculation. I tried to intervene, but it was too late. The knowledge spread in the room faster than the scent of roasted turkey. Dinner, which had been warm and filled with habitual politeness, shifted like a tide revealing rocks beneath calm waters. My father's fork paused midair, his face tightening. My mother set down her napkin, her fingers drumming impatiently. Every glance, every smile, every hollow question about work or life dissolved into something that looked more like entitlement than care. "You can't keep this from us," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper as she leaned toward me in the kitchen later. But her words carried the weight of a demand. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was expectation. My family had always been good at wanting things without thinking how they were earned. But I had never seen it so clearly, not until that night. The question started gently. "How did you manage this?" And then escalated into requests. My father needing to erase debts, my mother hinting at a new house, and Nora calculating the education costs for her children. Each demand carried an unspoken accusation, that I had been selfish in silence, hoarding my success instead of sharing it. I stayed seated, holding my fork, pretending to carve turkey as if nothing had shifted. But I wasn't pretending. I was mapping every moment, every past slight, every time my efforts had gone unnoticed, every time I had supported them quietly while they assumed my life was ordinary. And then my mother spoke. "You owe us, Lara. Family takes care of family." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict, a declaration that my independence was a debt I had yet to repay. I felt my chest tighten. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. This Thanksgiving would not end with shared pie and hollow smile. This would be the last time my loyalty was assumed, the last time my silence would be mistaken for weakness. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply let the weight of her words settle, and in that silence, I made a decision. My family didn't realize what I was capable of, or how far I could go to define what right really meant. That night, as laughter and clinking silverware echoed around me, I realized my path had diverged from theirs forever. This was the Thanksgiving that changed everything. Growing up in the small town of Ashwood, Oregon, my childhood felt like a constant balancing act between expectation and invisibility. Our house was modest, the walls thin, the air heavy with rules my parents seemed to enforce more out of habit than affection. Dad, Dean Quinn, had a way of praising Nora that left me shrinking into corners. "Nora's the smart one, Lara just dreams," he would say, smiling at her while I learned to fold my disappointment neatly into silence. Mom had her favorites too, though her affection often came wrapped in criticism. My efforts were measured, compared, and rarely acknowledged. Yet somehow I adapted. Late nights at the kitchen table became my sanctuary, where textbooks and borrowed laptops transformed into gateways out of a life that never seemed to hold space for me. I wasn't just dreaming. I was planning, building, calculating the smallest steps toward independence while the rest of the house argued, laughed, and slept. By 25, those quiet hours had turned into something tangible. I launched a small coding startup, pouring everything into it while keeping my ambitions invisible. The irony was that my family had never once asked what I did or how I managed it. They assumed my life mirrored their expectations of ordinary. When the company was acquired, I didn't announce it. I didn't feel the need to brag. Success was my own, private, and I liked it that way. This Thanksgiving marked the first time in 4 years I had returned home. I thought I could blend into the familiarity, sit at the old oak table, smell the roast and the pumpkin pies, and remember what warmth once felt like. I imagined polite smiles, casual conversations, maybe even a spark of curiosity about my life. But the illusion shattered the moment they glimpsed my achievement. The hope I had carried, tiny and fragile, was replaced by calculation in their eyes. No one asked how hard it had been, how many nights I had skipped parties or birthdays, or how I had carried myself quietly through a world that didn't expect women like me to succeed. Instead, they began to measure me, not by love or pride, but by what they could extract. I remembered Dad's chuckle as Nora described her latest purchase, Mom's eyes flickering toward mine as if to silently question. Why not you? It was the same pattern from childhood, only sharper, more insistent. The warmth I had imagined dissolved, replaced by subtle shifts in posture, looks exchanged behind my back, and a growing sense that nothing had changed about them. They were still counting, still taking stock, still measuring my worth against their needs. Even as I carved the turkey and passed the rolls, I felt the weight of every quiet victory I had earned without recognition. Those 4 years away hadn't softened their blindness. They had only reinforced it. I realized then that the life I had built in secret, the independence I had clawed for, wasn't just mine to cherish. It was armor against the constant demand for approval I had carried since childhood. By the time dessert came, I understood that nothing in this home had shifted. The small town, the oak table, the familiar chatter, it all belonged to the past. And I belonged elsewhere, even if they didn't yet know it. That Thanksgiving, amidst the clinking forks and murmured conversations, I acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Returning home had reminded me why I had left, and why I would never surrender the freedom I had earned. I had just stepped into the kitchen to refill my glass when Nora appeared out of nowhere, her presence sharp, her eyes narrowed like a hawk circling prey. You can change all our lives with just one transfer, she hissed, leaning so close I could feel the heat of her breath. Her words carried an edge I hadn't heard since childhood. Entitlement, accusation, a hunger that was impossible to ignore. I froze, unsure if she expected an answer or if she was merely testing boundaries. Before I could respond, voices rose from the dining room. My father, Dean, spoke first, measured but insistent. It's only fair, Laura. I've been buried under this mortgage for years. Surely you can help. His tone carried expectation, not curiosity. Mom followed quickly, her voice tinged with demand rather than love. And a new house, Laura. Something more comfortable, somewhere we deserve. You've done so well, why hold back? Nora's next words were not a plea, but a prescription. I need college funds for my kids. You've got what it takes to make that happen. Her smile was tight, calculated, and completely devoid of gratitude. I took a breath, letting the words settle around me. They were not celebrating my accomplishment. No one asked how I had built my career, the nights I had sacrificed, the countless failures I had endured before any of this came to fruition. Instead, they were cataloging what they could take. I worked for this, I said softly, keeping my voice steady despite the rush of disbelief and anger. Every bit of it is mine. I didn't inherit it, and I didn't take shortcuts. I earned it. The silence that followed was tense but brief. Dad's brow furrowed, Mom's jaw tightened, and Nora's lips pressed together like she was tasting defeat. Then the accusations began, subtle at first, sharp and deliberate after. Selfish, cold, ungrateful. Words I had heard in passing during my teenage years now came barreling back with renewed intensity. I set down my glass carefully, feeling the weight of every expectation, every demand, every eye fixed on me with judgment rather than. Yet I remained calm. My refusal was not anger. It was assertion. I had built my life quietly, carefully, and no amount of familial pressure would diminish the value of what I had achieved. But the tension did not waver. My mother's patience snapped, and the air in the kitchen thickened with anger. Without warning, she hurled her plate toward the sink. The crash of ceramic echoed in the room, a punctuation to her final words. You'll regret this, Laura. I stood frozen, hearing the metallic clatter reverberate against the walls. The veiled threats, the expectation, the vehemence. It all crystallized in that moment. No one congratulated me. No one acknowledged the effort, the sacrifice, the victories I had quietly carried through years of obscurity. All they saw was what they could claim. And yet, even as the kitchen emptied with murmurs and tension, I felt a strange clarity. This was no longer about warmth, affection, or family tradition. This was about boundaries, independence, and the stark realization that I would no longer bend to demands disguised as concern. That plate smashing, that hissed warning, it was the exact line I needed to cross in my mind. I would not yield, and I would not falter. This was the Thanksgiving where loyalty and generosity collided with entitlement, and I realized that standing firm would be far more challenging than any past obstacle, but infinitely more necessary. By the time I reached the hotel, the evening had drained me. My hands still trembled slightly from the confrontation, and every nerve felt raw from the sharpness of my family's expectations. I barely acknowledged the clerk as I checked in, letting the room door click shut behind me like a barrier between me and the chaos I had left behind. I sank onto the edge of the bed and immediately reached for my phone. Messages poured in faster than I could process. Nora demanding explanations, Dad outlining the urgency of his debts, Mom hinting at disappointment that bordered on punishment. And then Craig, Nora's husband, whose tone swung between incredulous accusation and veiled threats. Every notification felt like another weight pressing down on my chest, reminding me that leaving hadn't ended the storm, It had only shifted its location. Scrolling through the texts, I remembered the quiet sacrifices I had made over the years. The small loans I had given without fanfare when Nora's bills piled up. The birthday presents I had slipped into envelopes unnoticed. The boxes of essentials I had sent during times when they claimed life had turned against them. I had been the invisible support beam holding parts of their lives together, yet they now painted me as the villain for refusing to give more. With a steady hand, I began deleting the messages, one by one. The anger, the entitlement, the expectation. I erased it from my screen as if wiping it from my reality. But just as I reached the last batch, one message remained, unopened until now. It was from Maya, my niece, and the words were simple but piercingly sincere. Aunt Laura, I don't get why they're mad at you. I love you. I held the phone closer, rereading her words several times. The honesty in a 14-year-old's text carried a clarity I hadn't realized I needed. It reminded me that not everyone in that household had become a reflection of greed and expectation. Maya's affection was untouched, pure, and it anchored me, preventing the familiar spiral of guilt from taking hold. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the night settle into a quiet determination. Isolation, I realized, could be protective. Distance could give me the perspective that proximity had stolen. The hotel room, impersonal and sterile, was now a refuge where I could breathe without judgment, think without interruptions, and plan without fear of intrusion. And plan I would. The idea of silence began to feel strategic rather than lonely. No immediate responses, no explanations, no concessions. For the first time in years, I could act without performing for their approval or mitigating their disappointment. I started to outline, mentally, a course of action that would be unexpected, precise, and entirely mine. Something that would assert my independence while preserving the quiet connections that mattered, like the one with Maya. As I powered down my phone for the night, I felt a subtle shift. The fury, the guilt, the relentless pressure, they hadn't disappeared, but they no longer had control. I would remain quiet, deliberate, and patient. They assumed my compliance would break under weight. They didn't yet understand that restraint could be a weapon, that absence could be louder than any confrontation. That night, as the hotel lights flickered softly outside the window, I allowed myself a moment of calm. I was shaken, yes, but no longer defeated. And in that quiet, I began to shape a plan they would never see coming. It had been weeks since Thanksgiving, but the echoes of that night lingered like a stubborn shadow. My phone rang abruptly one afternoon, and the name on the screen made my chest tighten, Craig. I answered, bracing myself for another round of lectures or manipulations. "Laura, it's time to help your family again," he said immediately, voice sharp and impatient. He listed expenses, hinted at emergencies, and wrapped every request in the language of obligation. I listened, silently tallying the ways I had already contributed over the years, ways that had never been acknowledged or appreciated. When he paused, I replied with a calm I didn't fully feel. "Craig, I'm consulting my lawyer. I'll be in touch." Before he could respond, I ended the call. The abrupt click of disconnection was oddly liberating. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating, apologizing, or justifying. I was asserting boundaries. Later that evening, I sat at my home office desk and began a deliberate series of actions I had postponed for years. I moved money into separate accounts, restructured my trust, and secured my assets in ways that left no room for interference. Then, almost impulsively, I made a sizable donation to several anonymous charities in their town, organizations supporting families, children, and local schools. The irony was delicious. The people who had demanded my wealth would never know they had benefited indirectly. I called Jesse Hale, my lawyer and trusted advisor, and walked him through my plans. His voice was steady and reassuring. "Laura, if they try to take legal action, everything is airtight. You owe them nothing, and they have no leverage. You've done everything necessary to protect yourself." Hearing those words allowed a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying to lift. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that generosity meant acquiescence, that love required sacrifice, even when it was undeserved. But now, I understood something crucial. Protection could coexist with generosity, and discipline could coexist with poetry. As I reviewed the documents and balances on my screen, a new clarity emerged. Revenge didn't have to involve confrontation or cruelty. It could be subtle, clever, and almost artistic, an elegant demonstration of autonomy that communicated the consequences of entitlement without raising my voice. The thought sparked a plan that took shape in my mind with careful precision. A design to teach my family what independence truly meant, a lesson in respect and boundaries that no argument could convey. I pictured scenarios, moves that would ripple quietly through their lives, each action deliberate, each outcome unavoidable yet delivered without malice. The satisfaction wouldn't come from humiliation, but from inevitability. Their assumptions about my compliance would crumble, replaced by the realization that my autonomy could not be challenged. For the first time since they had discovered my fortune, I felt a sense of power that wasn't fueled by anger or revenge, but by clarity and control. The Thanksgiving tension had catalyzed a transformation in me, one that turned frustration into strategy, betrayal into opportunity. By the time I closed my laptop, the plan was no longer a concept. It was a framework. I would move carefully, quietly, and efficiently. No one would see it coming, yet its impact would be undeniable. Independence, I realized, wasn't just a state of being. It was a language, and I had just begun to speak it fluently. The quiet of my home was shattered one morning by the ping of my email. At first, I thought it was another routine notice from my lawyer. But when I opened the message, my stomach dropped. Nora had filed a lawsuit. Not just a demand, not a request, but an official claim accusing me of promising financial support. My own sister, twisting years of casual generosity and private conversations into legal leverage, had turned my life into a spectacle. Shock gave way to disbelief as I read through the documents. They had pulled snippets of my old messages, carefully removing context, painting me as a woman who had pledged fortunes she never intended to share. Every word was manipulated, every gesture reframed. It wasn't just a legal maneuver, it was a deliberate attempt to rewrite history, to cast me as the villain in a story only they could control. Jesse Hale, my lawyer, reviewed everything with his usual meticulous care. "They're fabricating evidence, Lara," he said firmly, pointing out the inconsistencies. "None of this holds up. You have full protection. You owe them nothing." His reassurance should have lightened the weight on my shoulders, but it didn't. The truth is, it wasn't the legality that hurt. It was the realization that people I had trusted, who shared my blood, had willingly chosen deceit over understanding. Word traveled fast in Ashwood. By the end of the week, the town I grew up in, the same streets I had wandered as a child, the same neighbors who once waved hello, treated me as if I had betrayed some unspoken moral code. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Sideways glances replaced greetings. I became the cautionary tale of ambition and secrecy, the person everyone whispered about but never approached. The emotional toll was heavier than the financial implications. For the first time, I recognized the full depth of the illusion I had been carrying, the belief that family love was unconditional, that blood guaranteed loyalty. Every expectation, every unspoken rule I had clung to, dissolved in the face of their betrayal. They didn't want to celebrate my independence. They wanted control, validation, and entitlement. Sitting in the quiet of my living room, surrounded by the absence of applause or recognition, I felt a mix of anger, grief, and resolve. I had protected myself legally, yes, but protection alone didn't convey the lesson they needed to learn. They had crossed boundaries they had no right to, twisting affection into leverage, and I realized the only way to respond was by showing them the true consequence of losing me. No immediate actions, no heated confrontations, just a careful, deliberate recalibration of their expectations. They had underestimated me for years, assuming my silence and generosity would continue indefinitely. Now, the betrayal they had chosen would become the mirror reflecting their greed, entitlement, and short-sightedness. In that moment, I vowed that they would understand the weight of my absence. The lesson wouldn't be loud or vindictive, it would be undeniable. For the first time, I felt the clarity of purpose that had been simmering beneath my anger. They needed to experience what it meant when I refused to bend, when I refused to forgive entitlement disguised as need. The betrayal had cut deeper than I anticipated, but it also crystallized a truth I had known all along. Independence was not negotiable, and the people who valued control over respect would soon confront the reality of my boundaries and the emptiness left in their wake. Weeks passed in quiet calculation before I acted. I had no desire for confrontation, no wish to witness the anger my next steps would ignite. Everything I did would be meticulous, indirect, leaving no trace of my hand. First, I arranged the purchase of my parents' mortgage anonymously. The documents were signed, the transfers complete, yet not a single person in the family knew who had intervened. At first, it seemed as though nothing would change. They continued to call, text, and send letters, relentless in their demands, confident in their assumed leverage. But slowly, the effects of months of overdue payments began to manifest. Notices arrived at their doorstep, each one more urgent than the last. I never celebrated the progress, never acknowledged the upheaval. I simply watched as inevitability unfolded, letting the law take its course. Eventually, eviction notices arrived. The house that had once been a symbol of control, comfort, and pride was now a place of displacement. Watching from a distance, I noted the tension, the panic, the realization that their entitlement had limits. Yet I never gloated, never reached out, never gave them a glimpse of the orchestration behind their discomfort. My satisfaction was quiet, contained, and complete. Meanwhile, The lawsuit against me had created ripples beyond our family wall. Craig, Nora's husband, began facing consequences of his own. The scandal surrounding the court case leaked into his professional world, and months later, he lost his position. Irony wasn't lost on me. Unbeknownst to anyone, I had quietly invested in the very company where he had worked. The coincidence felt like poetry, the kind of justice that needed no explanation, no celebration, and no public acknowledgement. Throughout it all, I maintained distance. No phone calls, no confrontations, no vindictive messages. My family was left to navigate the fallout of their own actions, each repercussion a reflection of entitlement they had refused to temper. I had no desire to explain, no need to prove superiority or intelligence. Their discomfort was sufficient, but not all of my focus was on retribution. I wrote a handwritten letter to Maya, my niece, the only one who had never wavered in her affection. I poured into it encouragement, guidance, and affirmation, letting her know that independence, integrity, and perseverance mattered more than inherited privilege or familial manipulation. Alongside it, I established a trust fund to support her education, a gift that carried meaning and opportunity rather than obligation or control. As I sealed the envelope, I realized that this was the essence of my approach: deliberate, precise, and quietly transformative. I had rewritten the narrative of power and control in my family without raising my voice or resorting to public shaming. Every move had been strategic, every outcome calculated, and the result was undeniable. The silence was the final stroke. No one could trace it back, no one could argue with the outcome, and no one could diminish the lesson embedded within them. My revenge was not loud, not brash, not vindictive. It was surgical, quiet, and complete. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure. The family that had demanded my submission was confronted with the limits of entitlement, and yet I had maintained my own integrity. In doing so, I discovered that justice could be exercised without malice, that power need not be wielded with fury, and that true independence required patience, planning, and restraint. The afternoon was quiet, the light filtering softly through the curtains of my new apartment. I had settled into a rhythm of work, reading, and occasional walks. Life that was unhurried and free from the tension that had once shadowed me. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, slicing through the calm. I opened it to find Nora standing there, gaunt and visibly shaken, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and pleading. Her shoulders slumped, her carefully maintained composure gone, replaced by vulnerability that was both new and unsettling. She looked at me as though searching for the warmth that had once existed, for an entry point to repair the damage she and her family had caused. I need to talk to you, she stammered, her voice fragile. Please, Lara. I'm sorry for everything. Can you forgive me? I studied her carefully. The desperation in her tone was unmistakable, but I also recognized the familiar pattern, the subtle attempt to rewrite history, to erase accountability, to shift responsibility onto me once again. I didn't move, didn't respond immediately, letting her words hang in the air like a fragile glass ornament that could shatter at any moment. You didn't come for forgiveness, I said finally, my voice calm but firm. You came for a reset button. The words were soft, almost gentle, yet carried the weight of recognition. I had seen this before, attempts to restore the old order, to reclaim entitlement without change. Nora's shoulders drooped further, tears breaking free and rolling down her cheeks. She sobbed quietly, an echo of remorse mixed with the fear of loss and the shock of consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. But my stance did not waver. I didn't reach out, didn't offer comfort, didn't soften in response to her tears. You taught me something important, I continued, my tone steady. Family isn't about shared blood or convenient bond. It's about who honors your boundaries, who doesn't betray your trust when you say no. That's the family worth keeping. Her cries filled the doorway, a mixture of grief, frustration, and recognition of her own failing. I felt no satisfaction in her pain, only clarity. The lesson she had avoided for years, the principle that love cannot be coerced, that respect cannot be demanded, was unfolding naturally. Nora's gaze fell, searching for a response I would not provide. She had come seeking absolution or perhaps restoration of control, but she found only quiet firmness. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that apologies alone could not undo actions, that entitlement could not override integrity, and that some boundaries were absolute. After what felt like an eternity in the doorway, she stepped back. Her movements were slow, deliberate, weighed with defeat. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving behind silence thick with unspoken truths and the residue of accountability she had refused to acknowledge before. I closed the door gently, feeling a strange sense of relief. The confrontation had been inevitable, yet I had remained unmoved, guided by the clarity I had built over months of planning and reflection. The echoes of the past lingered, but they no longer had power over me. In that silence, I realized something essential. Closure wasn't about reconciliation. It was about recognition, understanding the consequences of choices and the meaning of autonomy. And for the first time since that fateful Thanksgiving, I felt fully free. The cabin sat on a cliff overlooking the restless Pacific, its windows catching the light of dawn and the endless rhythm of the wave. I had chosen it for its solitude, its distance from everything I had left behind, and the quiet promise of a life rebuilt on my own terms. Here, there were no expectations, no judgments, no demands, only space to think, create, and breathe. Each morning began with the scent of salt and pine, a cup of coffee, and a long walk along the jagged coastline. Slowly, I immersed myself in projects that mattered beyond money or family. Local youth tech programs had openings, and I volunteered, sharing skills I had honed over years in the tech world. Teaching coding, problem-solving, and digital creativity to eager minds reminded me that purpose could be found in growth, in connection, and in nurturing potential rather than satisfying entitlement. The work was rewarding in ways I had never imagined. Each student's small victory, a successfully built app, a solved algorithm, a newfound spark of curiosity, felt more powerful than any check I had ever written. I realized that the satisfaction I sought didn't come from control over others or quiet revenge. It came from investing in something enduring, something meaningful that couldn't be stolen or undermined. One evening, as the sky blushed with sunset, a familiar figure approached the cabin. Maya, now older, carried the confident energy of a young woman who had begun shaping her own path. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, the same innocence and honesty I remembered from years ago, but with a newfound determination that made me proud. "Aunt Laura," she said, settling onto the porch railing, "I want to be like you, but maybe with a better family." We laughed softly, the sound mingling with the distant crash of waves against rocks. Her words carried no bitterness, no obligation, just honesty and a quiet hope I hadn't realized I longed for. In her gaze, I saw potential untethered from the past, a chance to nurture someone without the baggage that had once weighed so heavily on me. That night, after she left, I walked along the shoreline, the sand cold beneath my feet and the water stretching endlessly before. I thought about everything that had led to this point, the betrayals, the confrontations, the careful measures I had taken to reclaim autonomy. In the past, I had feared that asserting myself, protecting what was mine, or delivering quiet consequences might leave scars not just on my family but on me. Instead, I discovered the opposite. My decisions had not destroyed me, they had liberated me. I had sculpted a life defined not by the whims of entitlement, but by purpose, clarity, and connection chosen freely. The freedom I had carved was not empty. It was alive, tangible, and deeply fulfilling. The ocean roared beneath the cliffs, indifferent to time or circumstance, and yet I felt intimately connected to its rhythm. Life, like the tide, moved forward relentlessly, carrying lessons, losses, and growth along with it. In that endless motion, I found peace. My revenge had been precise and silent, yes, but it was ultimately inconsequential compared to the gift I had given myself. Independence, choice, and the chance to nurture a legacy built on integrity rather than obligation. For the first time in years, I smiled without reservation, knowing that freedom was not a prize taken from others. It was a life reclaimed. Thanksgiving arrived again, crisp and quiet along the Oregon coast. The cabin, perched on its familiar cliff, was filled only with the faint scent of pine and the distant rhythm of wave. For the first time in years, I welcomed the day without obligation, without expectation, and without the weight of confrontation pressing against my shoulders. I set the table for one, arranging a simple meal with care, letting the ritual itself become its own form of meditation. I ate slowly, savoring flavors rather than distractions, listening to the wind stir the treetops outside the window. My thoughts drifted over the last year, the tension of family demands, the calculated maneuvers to protect myself, the lessons learned from betrayal, and the quiet victories achieved without drama. The waves below mirrored the passage of time, relentless, steady, and indifferent, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. A knock on the door broke my contemplation. I wasn't expecting anyone, yet a familiar warmth stirred in my chest. Opening the door, I found Maya standing there, holding a pie, her smile wide and unguarded. She had grown taller, her confidence more pronounced, yet the same earnestness in her eyes reminded me of the girl who had once sent me a simple text in confusion and affection. "You didn't have to come," I said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "Yeah, I did," she replied, setting the pie down on the counter. Her tone was gentle but firm, her presence a deliberate choice rather than obligation. "You're the only family that ever showed up." Her words sank in slowly. They weren't just about blood or tradition. They were about attention, care, and the act of showing up when it mattered. The clarity of it, the honesty and warmth, made my chest ache in the best way. I realized that, for all the conflicts and careful strategies of the past year, what endured wasn't revenge or resentment. It was connection forged through choice rather than expectation. We moved to the small dining table, sharing the pie and stories, laughter bubbling naturally without pressure. Maya spoke of her studies, her plans in computer science, and her desire to create, to innovate, to build a future untethered from family dysfunction. I listened, offering guidance and encouragement, realizing that this bond, cultivated quietly and deliberately, held far more meaning than any restitution or confrontation could have provided. The afternoon stretched lazily, sunlight shifting across the room, waves murmuring below. I watched Maya move around the cabin with ease, comfortable in a space I had shaped, nurtured, and protected for both of us. In her presence, I felt a soft but profound fulfillment, not from control, not from proving a point, but from the quiet reward of being trusted and valued. I gazed out over the ocean, letting the horizon absorb my reflections. The past year had been turbulent, filled with emotional storms and careful maneuvers, but it had led me to this: a Thanksgiving spent in peace, with someone who had chosen to stand with me unconditionally, without demand or expectation. For the first time, I understood that love could be deliberate, earned, and sustaining. Revenge had served its purpose, but connection had proven its power. Quietly, I smiled, recognizing that this chosen family, small and intentional, was everything my life had needed. And as the sun dipped toward the water, the day felt whole, complete, and profoundly real. Do you think I did the right thing by cutting my family off, or should I have given them another chance? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this.